calendar page on our website. So we are going to go ahead and begin. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. This is part 2 of our shelter series of webinars. We are going to talk a little bit about rules reduction in shelter this morning. Our key focuses this morning are going to be some strategies for successfully reducing rules in shelter, what that should look like, how you should evaluate the current rules that you have in place, how you should start making change, and why we're moving to this sort of rules reduction model. Now, because we are in webinar format, I understand that it's a little bit harder to have some of these more difficult conversations. I know rules reduction is obviously, it's a tricky thing, and it's one of those things that whenever I do training on it, there's always a lot of discussion and questions about how to implement certain things within shelter, and a lot about kind of communal living concerns and issues. I will try to answer as many questions as I can on the webinar. So if you do have questions or concerns, please feel free to type them in your chat box and send them to me, and I'll answer them throughout the webinar. But please also don't hesitate to email or call me and reach out. I can talk to you privately about any issues that you may be having around trauma-informed care and rules reduction within shelter. And I'm also happy to set up a training with your organization or with your staff, either a more formal training or a more informal training. We've had a lot of shelters lately who I have gone out to speak with their staff and just kind of have an hour, 2 hours, or even an afternoon where they can just ask questions and talk about their concerns and issues and emerging issues that they're seeing. So we can do something a little more informal as well. But please don't hesitate to contact me and let me know what your needs are. And I will have my contact information at the end of the webinar, so you'll have access to my email if you don't have it already. So the first thing that I want to mention is the reason why we are moving towards a rules reduction model as part of a whole approach to trauma-informed care within shelters. And really the reason is we want to create shelters as an empowerment-focused, healing-focused environment that is not replicating some of the power and control issues and dynamics that were present in the abusive relationship that the residents have fled. So when they're fleeing abuse and coming into the shelter, we want to create an environment that doesn't mirror or model the restrictive, controlling nature of the environment that they fled. We want something that's empowerment-focused, that's survivor-centered, and that is less restrictive and less punitive. Now, as we're moving forward, you're going to see that that doesn't mean that rules don't exist in shelter, and that that doesn't mean that you can't have hard conversations about what we would call communal living or community living issues. What that means is that we don't want to be punishing our residents for things like dishes and not making up beds and not cleaning rooms. We want to have conversations and facilitate communal living in the best way that we can. But again, we don't want to create or replicate those kind of abusive power and control tactics. So when you're thinking about or reflecting on the rules, the policies, the guidelines that exist within your organization, you want to make sure that you're following a couple of general rules when you're writing them, when you're rewriting them, when you're evaluating them. The first thing is that written materials should invite cooperation, they should invite collaboration, and mutual accountability, both accountability from residents and accountability from staff and volunteers. Because when you're giving someone a piece of paper that has these rules or guidelines written on them, we want it to be something that is clear, that is written in a way that is accessible and understandable, that is written in a way that, again, invites cooperation and lets people know what their responsibilities are and what they should expect when they come to shelter or when they stay in shelter. So an example of this is our program has set up the following rights and responsibilities to clarify expectations and roles and to keep harmony in the shelter where multiple families and individuals live together and share common spaces. We hope you will keep the common good and others' safety and comfort in mind while living here. So again, that is friendly. That is inviting cooperation. It is laying out expectations of community living and common shared spaces and common shared goals. So we're starting out with a friendly tone that assumes positive intent in everyone who is coming into our agency. And so the next piece is policies and guidelines that you have in place that you choose to keep in place within your shelter, within your paperwork or your handbook or whatever you want to call it, should make a real distinction between those behaviors that facilitate communal living, those ideal behaviors, versus behaviors that threaten residents' ability to stay in shelter. So when you speak about a responsibility to have a clean environment, for instance, we want to be very distinctive between the fact that having a personal responsibility to help keep our shared environment clean is not the same thing as, or is not on the same level of severity as, for instance, committing an act of violence within shelter, which will get you immediately and summarily exited from shelter. So you want to be distinct between rules that can and do threaten your ability to stay in shelter versus these bits and pieces of advocacy and communal living. And we want to be very distinct in helping clients understand how those different things will be addressed. So for instance, if there is an issue surrounding a community and shared living environment, it'll be addressed through advocacy and conversation. Versus if there is an issue of safety and security, like, again, violence in shelter, this is what you can expect. You can expect an exit, and what an exit looks like is this. So being distinct and clear in what clients can expect and what you expect from clients. Remembering that just being in shelter can be alienating, can feel threatening. That victims are forced to leave their homes to come into shelter for safety, and that can already, at the outset, feel like a punishment because they're being forced to leave their bed, their belongings, their home, sometimes their pets, their resources. And yes, they're fleeing to what we hope is a safe space where they can begin to heal, but it still feels like they're being punished because their abuser is not being made to leave their home and their belongings, right? So the last thing we want to do is set out rules and guidelines in a tone that feels threatening and punitive. So whenever possible, we want to really separate the two. We want to give information about shared communal living outside of the context of here are the rules that can get you exited from shelter. We want to make sure that those are two very separate conversations that we're having with residents. And generally, we want to really focus on advocacy versus rule enforcement. And that's another key piece of the reason that why we're doing rules reduction models within shelter is that we want to look at giving our advocates room and the opportunity to really advocate, to really be having deep, important conversations with our clients that can help them to grow, that can help them to heal, that can help them to become independent, versus advocates constantly feeling as if their role is simply rule enforcement, as if their role is simply marking off a checklist or marking off warnings on a page. If we have 37 rules that residents are supposed to adhere to, including laundry and dishes and making our beds and all of these things, then advocates end up spending more time, like I said, checking off a list of who is doing what, than they do actually taking the time to get to know residents and advocate and find resources and help them work goal plans. So that's a big part of the reason why we have this movement away from having lots and lots of super highly structured rules. It's our responsibility to meet survivors where they are. So for instance, if they don't show up at a scheduled time for an advocacy or case management meeting, staff should take the initiative to go to them, to check on them, to meet them where they are, to, knock on the door, sit down with them in the TV room or whatever it is and say, how are you today? I miss seeing you today. Tell me how things are going with you. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what your needs are. Meet them where they are in the sense of their emotional needs, their safety needs, their healing needs, but also in a very real physical sense of going to them and checking in and not always expecting or putting the onus on the resident to be the one to check in with you. And so think about then, to that same end, how we can control the environment, not the rules, right? So for instance, if multiple residents are having difficulty with a particular rule, and in this case, like we said, we're moving away from rules altogether, so we're really talking about communal living concerns and issues. So if you see something happening, like a lot of residents are having trouble keeping their rooms clean, and this is becoming a concern of the staff, or if a lot of residents don't seem to be having constant eyes on their children and this is becoming a concern of the staff, is it possible that a physical fix can alleviate this problem versus punitive measures? And start thinking about, for instance, the cleanliness problem. Is it because there's not enough closet space or shelf space to organize their belongings? Are you putting people in a room where they're sharing with 2 or 3 or 4 other adults, and then the only storage space they have may be a bedside table or 1 foot of closet space. Is that enough space for someone to really organize their belongings and have places for them and keep them neat and clean? And how big of a deal is it at the end of the day? Can we create physical fixes like adding dressers, adding more space to organize their belongings? Can we have a conversation about the issue and let them know what the staff's concerns are? Or is it something that even needs to be an issue in the first place? Or is it something that, yes, in an ideal world, everyone's rooms would be spotless, but it's not enough of an issue for us to be concerned about room cleanliness when we have other more important things to be concerned about in terms of advocacy, safety planning, goal planning? And again, another example, if you have a rule in shelter that residents' parents are required to keep their children in physical sight at all times, but the playroom is a walled-in room that is not visible from the kitchen, so that means that parents can't see their children if they're cooking. That means that parents can't see their children if they go to advocacy, go to speak to the advocate. That means that if their children are playing, basically, then the resident has to be physically in the playroom with them at all times. Are we setting up a burden for someone who is a parent who also needs to meet with the advocate or needs to cook or needs to be on the phone with their attorney or needs to be working on sending out job applications? How can we facilitate these things happening? So maybe we change where the play space is. Maybe we rethink our rules about childcare and what that looks like within our space based on our physical space. Every shelter is different. Every physical space and physical environment in terms of shelters are different. So what rules and what guidelines and what you all need in place in terms of childcare and safety and babysitting plans and all of these things is going to be very different depending on what your shelter looks like and what the makeup is. But that's something that you need to take the time to consider. So as we're moving away from rules, what we're thinking about is rules versus statements of rights and responsibilities. Including a statement of rights and responsibilities in your shelter's intake packet can be helpful in clarifying a client's expectations and setting a positive tone for communal living. Many survivors enter shelter without knowing what to expect out of shelter living and without knowing what is expected of them. Or they enter shelter and have a very skewed perception of what shelter life is like based on negative stereotypes of shelters. A lot of them are based on homeless shelters and based on negative media around shelters. So people come in expecting the worst a lot of times. So advocates can help dispel a lot of these fears and a lot of this uncertainty by being open and honest about both the challenges of shelter living and the behaviors and expectations that make communal living easier for everyone involved. Clarifying what our expectations of clients' behavior are in an open, straightforward way, being very clear, being very honest, while also reminding clients that they have the right to expect to be treated with dignity. And this is an important step in equipping survivors to be able to navigate shelter life in a positive way. So the important piece of this is that really open, clear, honest communication that also, at the end of the day, cultivates a positive social environment within the shelter and positive interactions between residents and staff when they understand that you're being honest and clear with them. Creating a culture within shelter where clients have the right to not only give respect, but receive respect, gives the survivors the opportunity to embrace these rights in every aspect of their lives, right? It empowers them to speak out when they're experiencing violence. It empowers them to speak out when they're experiencing disrespect. It empowers them to speak out when they're experiencing discrimination. Because when you're saying, not only do we expect you to be kind and to not discriminate and to be nonviolent, what we're saying is you have the right to expect others to treat you that way as well. And if you're not experiencing that, if others are not treating you in a respectful way, then you have a forum to speak up about that. Clarifying residents' rights and responsibilities up front also gives advocates an opening to have difficult conversations with residents when conflicts arise from communal living. So if we are clarifying up front that, everyone who stays here has the right to a clean and healthy and safe environment, everyone who stays here has the right to an environment without disrespect, without discrimination, then if issues do come up, then you have an opening to have those hard conversations. Remember when we talked about the rights and responsibilities that everyone has for making this a good, healthy place to live. And let's talk about the issues that we're having here. Now, rights and responsibilities are in no way meant to be a three-strike type system where you have the ability to exit clients from shelter because they have not done dishes or whatever it is. It's not just an alternative for prohibitive rules list. It's a way to, again, encourage respect, encourage conversation, encourage cooperation, and empowerment. So that's what, when we're talking about this change towards rights and responsibilities. So some examples. An old rule might have been residents must respect staff, residents must respect other people and shelter property. But we also want to make sure that residents understand that they have the right to be respected. You have the right to be respected and the responsibility to respect others. So it's not just about you're coming in here and you have to act a certain way or we're going to kick you out, or you have to act a certain way or you're going to be in trouble. And even if we're not saying or clarifying what in trouble means, we know that survivors of violence are going to go to the worst case scenario, right? They're going to be thinking about worst case scenario. So we want to make it clear that we want you to be respectful in this environment, but you also have the right to be respected in return. So another example, you are responsible for the care and supervision of your own children at all times. So this gives no leeway in terms of childcare, babysitting, again, things like having an advocacy meeting where you can't necessarily have your eyes on your children while you're doing a safety plan or while you're talking about resources and housing. So moving to a right and responsibility that may look something like, you have the right to be supported in your role as a parent. And here are the ways that our organization can support you. And here are the things that we have in place to help you with your needs around childcare and parenting and children's resources and all of these things. Here are the things that we've put in place to help you with this, and you're not alone in this, and you're not on your own trying to navigate all of these things that come along with healing and empowerment, plus 24/7 eyes on your child, right? We have things in place to help you. So another rule is, a bedtime. Children should be in bed by 9 p.m., having some kind of curfew in place. Versus something like, each family has the right to safety and privacy and to establish schedules that allow each member adequate rest, peaceful time, and time to complete schoolwork, family obligations, work obligations, all of those things. So allowing people the grace and leeway to know what works best for their lives and their children's lives. And you may have, younger children that will be in bed by, 8 or 9 p.m. And you may have teenagers that have, sports and clubs or lots of homework or whatever it is that, developmentally appropriately are up later. Now, a lot of times this issue springs up because we don't want people, blasting music and yelling and, running up and down the hallways until, midnight. So what we can do is say, every person has the right to establish schedules and establish their own bedtimes and all of these things, but we also have quiet hours in place. So what we're saying is you can be awake and be doing your thing, but we need everyone to be respectful and quiet of those who do need to go to bed early. So quiet hours, start at 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. or whatever that looks like. Model rights and responsibilities, things like you have the right to be heard, you have the right to self-determination, you have the right to a healthy, sober, and drug-free environment. Every resident has the right to keep their presence at our program confidential. You have the right to reside in a program that works for you. And if shelter living is not working for someone, because shelter living doesn't work for everyone, and again, every shelter is different. And so one shelter setup may not work for someone, but another shelter setup may. So making it, if someone is in your program and the way your program is set up just really doesn't work for them, the layout of the rooms or whatever it is, make it about the program and not about the person, right? Some people may have anxiety and issues with having too many people packed in one place that they don't do well or whatever that may look like. So, if things like that come up, making it about the program and not about the failing of the person. So other example rights and responsibilities may be things like you have the right to be treated with respect and dignity by staff, volunteers, and other shelter residents, and you have the responsibility to grant that same respect to other residents and staff. You have the right to receive all organizational services that you're eligible for, including goal planning and advocacy services. You have the right to receive referrals to community resources and other victim services as needed, even if you're not residing in the shelter or actively participating in services offered. You have the right to an environment that is safe, accessible, and free from abuse, violence, weapons, and illegal activity. You have the right to be treated in an ethical manner and free from discrimination, just as you have the responsibility not to discriminate against others. You have the right to self-determination. We are here to support you in making your own decisions. You have the right to manage and set your own goals while you stay here. If you're having trouble with the responsibilities of communal living, staff will work with you individually and in-house meetings to create a plan that works for you and facilitates harmonious group living. So this leaves an opening for people to come to you and actually say, here's the issue I'm having, here's the concern that I'm having, here's the problem, here's why I'm concerned about this, or why this may be an issue. And so it gives them the opening to say, here's what's come up. Can you help? And it also gives staff the opportunity to say, we've noticed that you're having this particular issue with communal living, or this, this has come up and we've seen this as a concern. Let's make a plan. Let's talk through it. Let's figure out how we can make this better for everyone involved. So just because we're moving away from rules and we're reducing rules doesn't mean that there are no rules at all, right? So there are some model rules that exist for ensuring safety. Whoops, sorry about that. So model rules that exist for ensuring safety, and these are the rules that I'm talking about earlier. These are the pieces where an exit from shelter is or may be needed, okay? So these rules include no alcohol and drugs in the shelter, no violence in the shelter, not breaking confidentiality of the shelter location or of other residents within the shelter, and not bringing weapons into shelter. So these things are rules that are mentioned in the Tennessee State Shelter Standards. These are kind of what we call the Big Four, the deal breaker rules, because unlike things that facilitate communal living, unlike those community type rules, these things are about safety and health of survivors, of residents, and staff, okay? So these are the things that we should be clear, we should be open about what the rules are, and if a client endangers someone else, themselves, someone else, another staff member, by breaking these rules, then that is an exit from shelter. And you'll see in the OCJP manual, as well as the state shelter standards, that very clearly lay out kind of the guidelines of what an exit from shelter looks like, and what what paperwork and things that you have to record that and make sure it goes in the client's file. Recommendations, though, with regards to exiting individuals. Number one, it has to be written. So again, there are guidelines in the OCJP manual, in the shelter standards, about having this written out, okay? At least two people, at least two staff members should be involved in any decision concerning exiting a resident, okay? Safety should be taken into consideration when asking a resident to leave shelter, if possible, and I know it's not always possible depending on the situation, depending on the danger involved, especially if there's violent incidents in shelter, it may not be possible, but if possible, residents should be asked to leave during the daytime and should be given a recommendation of where to go, which would typically be homelessness resources. Because if somebody is breaking a rule, particularly rules around weapons and violence in shelter, we don't want to then be referring them to another emergency shelter or another domestic violence shelter. We want to be giving them some homelessness resources, and just making sure that best case scenario, if it's possible, we can have them exit during the daytime as a safety issue. Before asking someone to leave, make sure that the situation has been communicated clearly, that staff are clear on what happened and are not just going on the word of other residents, and that we're making sure that residents have been able to fully understand expectations and express their needs, especially if we're talking about a client who may speak limited English. When we did the intake, when we talked about shelter rules and expectations, did we make sure that we were clearly communicating this, that we had a qualified translator, a qualified interpreter, to make sure that the person actually knows and was informed of shelter rules. Now again, if somebody is committing an act of violence in shelter, that we don't have the leeway there, because that is about safety and security. But trying to, before something happens, before there is an incident, making sure that we are clear in our expectations and that we are able to clearly communicate with each client that we have within our shelter. So here are some tips for making these minimal rules work. Number one, any rules, any rights and responsibilities, any written residency packets or whatever that you have should reflect the agency's mission, should reflect the agency's core values. They should be regularly and routinely reevaluated and assessed because things change over time. And if you still have the same paperwork, the same rules, the same resident packet that you've had, even 5-10 years ago, although I've seen agencies who have had the same packets for 15-20 years, things have changed, right? Our understanding of effective advocacy has changed. Our understanding of trauma and trauma-informed care has changed. Technology has changed. So relating to our rules and things. So making sure that we're evaluating it regularly. Making sure that staff are healthy and that we're addressing burnout, that we're addressing stress, that we're addressing vicarious trauma. So that staff are healthy, because when staff are stressed out, when staff are working in traumatized environments, when they don't have outlets to start addressing and working on secondary and vicarious trauma that they may be experiencing, those stressed out staff are much more likely to be more punitive, to be more harsh, to be less understanding, to be less empathetic, and that's just because they're experiencing such a great deal of their own stress that it's harder for them to deal with what's going on with their residents and with the clients that they're working with. So make sure that you're addressing staff health and well-being as a main piece of trauma-informed shelter work in general. Make sure that there's collaboration between staff and management, and between staff and residents. That residents have space for feedback, that you're following up with people who have successfully moved on from your program to see what kind of feedback that they have, that you're getting, that when you assess and evaluate your rules and your intake policies and all of those things, that you're getting feedback from clients to know what's working in their eyes and what's not working, that you are collaborating with community providers and community members so that you're engaging all of the community resources that your clients may need in order to be able to give them a more holistic set of resources and set of services and referrals. And that, again, you are communicating clearly, you are being open and honest, and you are being very straightforward about what expectations are. Okay? So, some critical questions to ask when you're evaluating policies, procedures, rules, regulations, all of those things. Number one, is this more controlling than basic social norms would be outside of a program? So again, back to that example of 3 strikes you're out over like cleaning and dishes. Is this a norm that they would also be facing outside of the program, or is this a way that we're trying to exert control within our program that wouldn't be reflected in the outside world, except if the person went back to their batterer, frankly? Would we really want to make a resident who is in danger leave over a violation of this rule? So again, those communal living issues. Are we really going to throw a survivor out on the street over communal living issues? Or are we going to really risk the survivor returning to their batterer over communal living issues? Now again, those things that pose a safety risk, violence, weapons, those are different, but we're talking about communal living issues here. Is the risk that someone would very occasionally engage in this behavior worth the cost of subjecting all residents to the rule all the time? And so what we're talking about there is a lot of times you have some kind of unexpected bad event happen that causes an issue within shelter or among residents that becomes a very dramatic situation. And in the aftermath of that situation, staff put together some kind of really rigid, really punitive rule in order to try to keep it from happening again. And the reality is, a lot of times those situations are so unusual that the reason there wasn't a rule to begin with is because it hardly ever happens. But we're trying to exert control over our situation by creating these rules. And many times what that is we're not addressing the vicarious trauma that staff has experienced because of whatever the event was that happened. So the only outlet they have is to create these punitive rules. So again, that goes back to really addressing staff trauma and stress. Is the rule burdensome to a particular group of residents? For instance, do certain rules disproportionately affect disabled residents, or disproportionately affect residents with limited English capacity, or disproportionately affect residents with or without children? So are we being equitable in the rules that we're making, or are we making rules that burden certain groups of people? And so the biggest and most important thing that we have to think about when we're evaluating our rules and regulations is, does this rule mirror the abuser's control? Does this rule mirror a power and control modality that does more harm than good in a healing survivor, right? Why do we have this rule? Are the concerns that it reflects still relevant? Can we address this through advocacy and conversation rather than having a punitive rule? Is this something that is about staff's time management and making staff's job a little bit easier, or is it actually something that is helpful to the residents? Do the rules that we have create the kind of environment that we want, or do they create an environment where our residents are afraid and stressed out and fearful that they're going to be kicked out over small things. Okay? So in the end, does this rule actually accomplish its purpose? Does it actually create safety or just the illusion of safety? And again, this big one, does this rule mirror power and control dynamics? So, anybody have any questions? I know that we've talked through a lot of things and I've given you a lot to think about today. Again, my email is on the screen. You can always email me. You can always call me as well. I do encourage that, although I travel a lot. So typically email is a little bit easier of a way to get a hold of me. But again, I'm happy to work with you all about questions and concerns that you may have around these and any other shelter-related or trauma-informed care-related issues that you may be having. So I am going to give it a few minutes for you all to put any questions that you may have in the chat box. I do want to say that when you exit out of the webinar today, that there will be an evaluation that pops up. Please, if you are watching with a group from your organization, I know that a lot of times organizations will have one person register, but they'll have 2 or 3 people kind of set in together and watch the webinar. On that evaluation, there will be a place that allows you to write everyone's names. That way we can get a really accurate count of how many people attended. And I will be sending out an email this afternoon with your certificate of attendance and resources related to this webinar. So you will get the PowerPoint and you will get some other related resources. So again, I'm going to wait a couple of minutes if anybody has questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate your time. We will have our 3rd shelter webinar in our shelter series next Wednesday, which will be on shelter environment. And again, you can find all of those on our website at tancoalition.org/calendar.